Welcome, everybody, to our Starr Forum on Republican Party Foreign Policy. I'm Steve Evera. I teach in the Political Science Department here at MIT. I teach classes on American foreign policy and on causes and prevention of war. And tonight we have two terrific guests to share thoughts on Republican foreign policy ideas and policies. Professor Dan Drezner of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy up the road at Tufts is here. He's a senior editor at National Interest, and he's a contributing editor at Foreign Policy. I recommend to all of you that you, for lively and enlightening reading, check out his blog at Foreign Policy Magazine, which is very widely read, one of the famous blogs on foreign affairs in the USA. Before teaching at Fletcher, he taught at the U of Chicago and at Colorado Boulder. He's written 4 books, including, he's great at titles. The titles are magnificent. I was just asking him about that last title. One of the books is Theories of International Politics and Zombies. And so you got to read that one to figure it out. But it sounds fascinating, actually. We were just chatting about it. And All Politics is Global, a 2007 book from Princeton. He's written widely in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. And you'll hear him on NPR, where he contributes to Market Watch. Marketplace, NPR's Marketplace show. And Michael Singh is joining us from the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. He formerly worked in the Bush administration as Senior Director for Middle East Affairs and at the National Security Council, where he was responsible for strategies, devising and implementing strategies on many Mideast issues, including preventing Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons, a very fraught current front burner issue, and the Arab-Israeli peace process, another fraught front burner issue, and human rights, the human rights policy toward the Middle East. He was on the NSC for 3 years as Senior Director for Middle East Affairs. He's also been Director for Iran and for Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. He has a MBA, I believe, from Harvard Business School, right? And a BA from Princeton. We don't see any MIT degrees. That makes us sad, but we love you anyway.
I don't have any MIT degrees.
He doesn't either. So without further ado, why don't we have 10 to 15 minutes of sort of introductory thoughts and comments. First from Mr. Singh, next from Mr. Drezner, and then we'll roll it around. I might ask you questions, all of you be thinking of questions, and we're here until 7 o'clock. So.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much. I appreciate you calling on me first, because I assume that Dan is going to ridicule Republicans in foreign policy, so it'd be awkward for me to talk about what Republicans think about foreign policy after he's done that. I'm going to try to be informal. We have an intimate group here, and so I hope that you guys will ask questions and we can have a conversation about this. I don't purport to be an expert on all things foreign policy. I'm by trade a Middle East guy who served in a Republican administration and is engaged now in sort of Republican foreign policy debates, and that's a perspective I bring. I also blog for foreignpolicy.com, so we have a lock on this panel apparently. Just a couple of introductory notes before I kind of go into the question at hand, which is the Republican Party in American foreign policy. First, I should note that my own academic background is in economics and not in foreign policy. And economics is much more satisfying than foreign policy. You know, you have testable theories. You have lots of nice graphs and models and things like that by which you can sort of explain what's happening. Even explain people's preferences for guns and butter and things like that. You also have clear data, we may disagree on how to lower unemployment, but we can all at least measure the unemployment rate and tell you how many people are out of work. And in foreign policy, I would say that not only can we not agree on the theories or on the models, we can't even really agree on the facts, which gives foreign policy debates a sort of elusive quality. We really lack a baseline by which to measure our success or our power overseas, and so it's hard to judge, much less actually devise foreign policy. So I want to just start with a little humility here in that we we're limited by a lot of these things. Second, I should note that, look, whatever we say about foreign policy theories and strategies and so forth, events intrude on the best laid foreign policy plans of any president. And while you would like to be very proactive in foreign policy and say, here's my strategy, now I'm going to go implement it, things happen, you know, and we saw with 9/11. I think we've seen now with the Arab Spring and President Obama's response to it, that often presidents find themselves reacting to what's happening in the world more than they would like to, and that actually sometimes can come to dominate a foreign policy. And so one question that would be interesting to ask, which isn't really the subject here, but that's sort of what is the next surprise going to be that's going to force a president to make a big foreign policy turn? You know, I'm sincerely hoping it's not going to be another attack on the United States, but it could be something having to do with cyber power. It could be something having to do with a different part of the world, which isn't on our radar screen right now. So with those two introductory remarks, I'm just going to make 5 brief observations about Republicans and foreign policy, our topic here. The first is Bush versus Obama, which, you know, Bush versus Obama has really dominated in many ways the first couple of years of discussion of Republicans and foreign policy or foreign policy, period. And one of the things that's frequently observed, and I think rightly, is that there's been a surprising degree, given the rhetoric in the 2008 campaign, a surprising degree of continuity between President Bush and President Obama's foreign policy. When you look at things like, take Guantanamo Bay and the detention facility there. Obviously, President Obama intended to close it. He hasn't been able to do that. In fact, it's still open, still contains a good number of people. Counterterrorism operations is a clear area of continuity where President Obama has not only really continued the Bush-era policies, but he's expanded those policies. He's sort of doubled down, in a sense, on things like drone strikes and so forth. And you could point to basic strategy on Iran, Iraq. In Iraq, you have the really remarkable situation where the Obama administration is, in fact, using Bush-era policy as kind of a cover for what it's doing, which is withdrawing on the timeline set by the Bush administration. So there really has, I mean, I think for any casual observer, the degree of continuity is quite striking. And the continuity has not just been in activities or policies, it's been in the strategic doctrines, which is something my good friend and colleague Will Imboden pointed out on foreignpolicy.com the other day, was that, in fact, some of the Bush administration's doctrines, such as preemption or democracy promotion, have been carried forward enthusiastically by President Obama. Where President Obama has sought to strongly depart from President Bush's policies, ironically enough, is where he's had, in many ways, the least success. Whether it's been in the Middle East peace process, where he wanted to show a strong focus on that from the beginning, and frankly, there's little to show for it. Engagement with rogue, or whatever you want to call them, states. You remember President Obama talked about having a chat with President Ahmadinejad of Iran and various other people. Climate change, the Russia reset, and so forth. And you know, the things that the administration will cite as sort of its successes in this upcoming campaign season, the death of Osama bin Laden, the death of Anwar al-Awlaki, the downfall of Gaddafi, are in many ways emblematic of those policies which were continued, but also they don't really constitute a foreign policy. I mean, they're remarkable events, but they don't really kind of tie together in terms of a foreign policy strategy or a national security strategy. In many ways, I'm inclined to think that the biggest difference between the two presidents is personal diplomacy. President Obama is more popular in the polls, no doubt, around the world. I mean, that's a clear difference between the two of them. but it is true, and surprisingly so, that President Bush had much better personal relations with world leaders than President Obama has managed to cultivate. I don't know why this is. I'm not a, you know, sort of, I don't know President Obama personally, and I'm not a psychologist. But those personal ties which President Bush cultivated with European leaders, South American leaders, Asian leaders, even Vladimir Putin, were essential to, I should say, are essential to foreign policy. I mean, I think this is an aspect of foreign policy which gets insufficient attention probably in sort of academic study, but just that personal ability to call up world leaders, to speak to world leaders, to deal with them on their own terms is something which seems to elude President Obama in a mysterious way. So how do we explain this surprising continuity between the two presidents? I guess the way I would explain it is to say that, while presidents change, really the problems in the world don't change on our electoral timetable, and American interests also don't change as one president changes to another administration. So while, close down Guantanamo was a nice campaign bumper sticker, when you actually sit down at the policymaking table and try to figure out how to do that, obviously it gets much more complicated, and the president may find that his options aren't that palatable, which I suspect is what happened with President Obama. To me, this should actually be encouraging to both Republicans and Democrats that this is the case, because it always used to be people said foreign policy was nonpartisan or was apolitical, and I think that we should all hope that we don't have wild swings necessarily in the way that we pursue our interests around the world, because the message that would send to the world and to both allies and foes, I think, would not be the right message, because it suggests that whatever we're doing now will be different in 4 to 8 years. So that's my first observation. My second observation is about American leadership and American decline. This is a theme which is coming up constantly in this presidential campaign. It's the question of American leadership. If you go to the websites of all the different Republican candidates, I think this appears prominently on all of them. And there's two basic questions about leadership. One is, should America lead? And the second is, can America lead? I would say that on the first question is relatively settled, I would say, for Republicans, where the answer is yes. On the left, though, I think that there is a disagreement in this area, and I think that the group there's misgivings, I should say, about American leadership, and there's two groups who I'd put them under the big umbrella of sort of declinists, but I think there's two kind of brands in a sense, two flavors of declinists. Those who think that it's a regrettable or bad thing that America is no longer leading or can't lead anymore, and those who think it's a good thing. The latter, I think, are unique to the left, and those are the people who see American leadership as somehow not a good thing in the world. And their view essentially is that American power, or really any national power, should be constrained for the global public good. And that the way you do this is through international law, international institutions like the ICC, or foreign policy philosophy, which is quite narrow in the way it's conceived, perhaps, where maybe you can only act with a certain level of international support. This second group, I think, those who see American decline and see this as somehow structural or inevitable, is a more serious group to contend with, and they're represented, I would say, on both the left and the right. It's not just on the left. In many ways, this group has been with us for a long time. I think that ever since the beginning of the American era, we've had people proclaiming the end of the American era. First it was the USSR, and then, I remember when I was growing up, it was Japan was going to overtake us and become the world superpower. Now it's China that's poised to overtake us. And all these people are sort of pointing to the narrowing of the gap, the supposed narrowing of the gap between the U.S. and the rest of the world, and they conclude that our ability to influence outcomes around the world is diminishing, if it's not fatally diminished already. And the policy prescription often for this group of declinists is laissez-faire. We're less capable, therefore we should do less. We should be less active. When problems break out, such as the problems in the Middle East right now, it's unfortunate, but there's very little we can do. And so maybe others should act, or maybe we should just let events run their course, and so forth. I've given short shrift to this argument, I should say. There are a lot of serious people who argue this. I can't replicate their arguments, and I'm sure Dan will rap me for this. But I'm more interested in pointing out sort of why I don't really buy into this notion of decline, including the more complicated explanations of it. First, I think that the argument tends to rely heavily on an exaggeration of our past ability to dictate events around the world. It's easy now to look back at sort of American power during the Cold War and think that somehow we were dictating events to Western Europe. But, in fact, Western Europe, France, the UK, and so forth, they weren't simply pliant allies. They had their own point of view. They didn't always do what we wanted. We weren't able to dictate outcomes around the world, as I think there are plenty of examples to demonstrate that. And many relationships were far worse at that time, and our influence in many places was less. For example, India, for a long time China, certainly Eastern Europe. In many areas of the world, we have allies now with whom we can work and through whom we can work that we didn't have before. Second, I think that the arguments also rely on a distorted version of what it means to lead. You know, and this question of what is leadership in a sense, what is being the preeminent power mean? I think that to dramatize the difficulties of leadership, they kind of put up this straw man of a unilateralist United States, which is trying to dictate outcomes, which is trying to sort of get our way and acting on our own. But the real difference is not between acting unilaterally and relying on coalitions. I think it's between trying to lead those coalitions and build international consensus on the one hand and following international consensus on the other. To me, leadership often means just having a point of view and being willing to go out and try to convince others of that point of view and get them to follow you. And in places like Libya, in my view, despite the narrative that's out there, we really did the latter. You know, we weren't forming an international coalition. We were kind of joining towards the end of that international coalition's formation. The third problem I have with this kind of declinism is it, and I think it's the most serious problem, is it really underestimates America's resilience and our capacity to renew ourselves and to reinvent ourselves, which is something I think we've shown many, many times throughout especially our modern history. There's a tendency to sort of take our current economic reform policy woes and just sort of project or extrapolate forward on a straight line and say this is the way it will be. Just like there's a tendency to take, say, China's growth and success and project that forward and say, well, China's inevitably rising. When I think that, in fact, a more, let's say, nuanced or sophisticated look would say that, well, who is able to adapt to a changing economy or changing global circumstances? America is in a better position, in my mind, to do that than a country like China, which has internal contradictions, which right now it's, in my mind, ignoring and will have to confront at some point and may greatly trouble them. And they also, I think, ignore the possibility that these new rising powers, who are perhaps narrowing the gap in terms of GDP and so forth, will actually help us amplify American power because, you know, the historical analogies break down a little bit because we've never really had a community of rising or strong democracies like we're seeing now with, say, Brazil, Turkey, India, and so forth. And I think there's a strong possibility that our interests and the countries and the interests of those countries, even though we're each pursuing our own interests, that those interests will coincide to a degree that perhaps they didn't in the past. So as I said, for Republicans, I think this is mainly a settled question. Although there are some on the right who do favor withdrawal from the world, there's a notion that America can and should lead. But there is a question, a very serious question, as to can the United States afford to lead? And this is my third sort of observation, is the role of resource constraints. Because there does seem to be general agreement, I think, between both parties that this notion of, well, global leadership begins at home. That if your own domestic economy is weak, you're not going to be strong on the world stage. That maybe is all they agree upon going from there. But there is agreement on that. And I want to focus on three big questions that are out there on this score. One is, how should we fix the economy? To me, there's a clear difference that for the Democratic Party wants to focus more on stimulus, additional stimulus. That's essentially what the jobs plan that's out there right now is, whereas Republicans are emphasizing structural reform. And I'm not going to go into that in any great depth because that's not the purpose of this talk. But what I want to do is connect it in a sense with the argument about government, big government, what is government doing, and so forth. One part of that emphasis on structural reform is this idea that the government is getting too large for the economy. This was put, I think, very well by Ed Lazier in a Wall Street Journal editorial or op-ed not too long ago. It's sort of a less dire or less advanced version of what's happening in Europe. And that largeness of government, anyone who works in government can tell you that that has a spillover effect into how our foreign policy is conducted. Because you build a bureaucracy, you add bureaus without subtracting bureaus, and those bureaus will want to sustain themselves and justify their existence by putting their issues on the agenda. And suddenly your agenda is full of issues. And your ability to set priorities, your ability to focus on what you need to focus on, gets diluted. And it leads to a sort of do-everything approach. Now, there's a danger in sort of conflating this do-everything approach with what I was talking about with respect to American leadership. Leadership doesn't mean doing everything everywhere. Again, I think that's a straw man. It means you can certainly prioritize, you must prioritize, and I think that'll make you a more effective leader. So there is this notion of needing to streamline the government, not only because of the budget issue, but because it will help us to focus on our priorities around the world. What about the defense budget, second? In my mind, the defense budget argument has focused a lot more on numbers than it should. We should start by talking about objectives and missions. What is it we want the Department of Defense to accomplish? And then what resources does it need to carry out that mission? That should be the way you approach the discussion. For example, if we want DOD, if we want the military to focus more on Asia, if we want our strategic focus to be more on Asia, well, that implies building more ships for the Navy, and ships are expensive. And so we have to figure out how we bring our strategy and our sort of defense spending plans into alignment with one another. And, is there waste at the Pentagon? Are there programs which, probably need to be reviewed and maybe have, whose purpose has passed? Maybe. I think that that's worth investigating, and the next president clearly needs to do that, whether it's President Obama or someone else. But should we sort of enact cuts without thinking first about the effects on our missions around the world? Absolutely not. And conversely, should we propose missions without talking about the resource implications and without defending the need for those resource requirements? Absolutely not. We do, though, need to start by talking about those missions, and we need to inject facts into the equation. Secretary Gates, for example, said recently, talking about the need in the future to make conscious choices about our military engagements around the world. Well, clearly we already make conscious choices about military engagements. There's no choice that a president is going to take more seriously than that. And it's clear that we're not engaged everywhere around the world doing everything. Our military engagements are actually relatively limited around the world. And so it's a more serious discussion, perhaps, than a lot of the rhetoric suggests. Third, how does the rest of the world come into all of this? There's this notion of nation building at home, which has been put out there by Richard Haas and some other people. And to me, this sort of implies that somehow the world is going to give us a timeout to okay, you know what, we're going to go off and take care of our domestic economy. We'll be back soon. It's just not the way the world works. We have to remain fully engaged in the world if we're going to stay fully engaged in the future. It's not like you can leave and then come back. And I think that talk about nation building at home needs to take into account that it has to be done simultaneously, not instead of talking about what our role overseas is going to be. My own view, and this is somewhere where I think you've seen some divergence amongst the different candidates, is that our global role actually enhances our economic fortunes and our leadership position. We operate in a global economy. Our success depends not only on what happens in our economy, with our GDP growth and so forth, and our industry. It depends on our trading partners and their success. And I think that this open international system that America has tried to cultivate, open markets, open investment, open to political participation around the world, this is not a luxury somehow of good economic times, but it is a way, it is a mechanism and a lever to help us regain those good economic times as well. That's I think, a place of distinction not only between Republican candidates, but between, frankly, the Republican and Democratic parties. Just lastly, and then I'll stop and defer to Dan. My fourth observation is this question of principles and interests and power in foreign policy. To me, one of the clearest distinctions between the Republican approach to foreign policy and the Democratic approach to foreign policy is on the question of principles. I was talking to a Democratic friend today who said that the Democratic approach to foreign policy is they don't believe in foreign policy. And I think what he means by that is that they don't believe in having principles to guide your foreign policy. This is somewhere where the Republicans strongly diverge from that view, where they believe that America remains a force for good and that we have the moral authority to lead in the world and that we should use that moral authority to try to achieve good outcomes around the world. My own view is that it is incredibly important to enunciate principles in your foreign policy and to enunciate, along with those principles, a clear and relatively simple strategy for accomplishing them. Because while I'm not anti-nuance at all, nuance, every foreign policy issue is nuanced. Nuance doesn't travel well down the bureaucratic chain, from the White House to the hundreds of thousands of people in the field. But principles do. And so if you have clear principles and a clear strategy, then that is much more likely to have reverberations in American actions on the micro level than the absence of those principles, let's say. To an extent, we're not that far past the age of wooden ships, right, where you would send someone off with kind of written instructions and then just trust them to do it. you know, we like to think that in the age of instant communication, this isn't what we do, but still what we're doing is we are training our people, we're giving them operating principles, and to a great extent, whether they're diplomats in the field or sort of platoon commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth, we're trusting them to do it on a daily basis. So, so the role of principles, I think, is an area of divergence. But the operating according to principles doesn't mean abandoning interests. I think where the Republican candidates would come out on this is that following our principles and advancing them is actually in our interests and compatible with our interests. And that we need to be able to, even when they come into conflict, do both at the same time. Say, work with an undemocratic ally while pushing them to reform, for example. I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to leave it at that, since I think I've gone on a little long here, and I'm going to listen with interest to Dan Drezner.
Thank you, Michael. Dan.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Michael for that incredibly cogent presentation on the GOP perspective, and indeed that actually cheers me up a fair amount, although after you hear my talk you might be less cheerful. I'm going to talk primarily about what we've heard in terms of foreign policy by the 2012 presidential candidates, which again is why this is going to be depressing. But let me add that if they are listening to people like Michael, then I will feel somewhat better once they get elected. You know, I have three basic points, which is as a policy wonk, you know, I listened to the state of the foreign policy debate among the GOP, and I can only describe it as appalling. As a political scientist, I am entirely unsurprised by this state of affairs. As a concerned American, I go back to being appalled. You know, let's first describe what is the state of the GOP campaign, foreign policy campaign. Well, first, the most seasoned, you know, most veteran foreign policy presence in the GOP field is former Ambassador to China, John Huntsman. He's polling at approximately 1%, so we can ignore him. Then we get to Mitt Romney, who's one of the co-front runners. He has put together a serious effort on foreign policy. If you take a look at his website, he's got a list of high-profile advisors. He came out with a major speech last month, along with a white paper. I believe it's entitled An American Century. And a lot of interesting ideas. There were also some other things in that document that were somewhat more questionable. Among other things in the speech, and this is a constant trope of the GOP, claims that President Obama has constantly gone on apology tours to the rest of the world and does not believe in American exceptionalism. You really have to twist the facts around a lot to come to that conclusion. There were a lot of complaints in the speech about President Obama throwing allies under the bus, that a Romney administration would reassure allies, which is great until you read the white paper and realize NATO is not mentioned once in the entire document, which would be a source of some concern. Other key allies like South Korea and Japan get perfunctory treatment at best, and Turkey is in fact treated more as an enemy than as a NATO ally. On China, the Romney plan is to simultaneously arm Taiwan to the hilt and yet somehow persuade China that it is in China's interest to get North Korea to disarm. I'm a little skeptical of pulling that off. Similarly, on Pakistan, we are somehow going to use sweet reason to convince the Pakistanis that it is in their interest to shut down things like the Haqqani network. Again, good luck with that. Now, despite those criticisms, let me be perfectly clear. Mitt Romney is far and away ahead of every other foreign policy, you know, the foreign policy statements of every other candidate. You know, Mitt Romney looks like George Kennan. You know, to go among all of the rest of the things, I don't have enough time for that. In terms of the also-rans, my favorite is Michele Bachmann, who at one point, I believe, claimed that Hezbollah was developing a presence in Cuba, based on a sort of internet story that really didn't go anywhere. There's sort of two potential sort of viable challengers to Romney at this point. As for Rick Perry's foreign policy statements waver between the total and completely vacuous or the bizarre. In terms of the vacuous, I highly recommend reading his speech to the VFW back in September. You basically could have taken a computer program filled with foreign policy cliches and generated sort of a random generator of the order in which they were going to appear. That would have been that speech. On the other hand, on the bizarre, you know, Perry has talked about things like sending the U.S. Army to Mexico to fight the drug war, which would certainly be of some interest to Mexicans. On the other hand, Perry really pales behind Herman Cain. And I could really go, you know, the entire hour and a half on Herman Cain. But the top three My favorites in terms of Herman Cain, first back in May on Fox News Sunday, he was talking about trying to adopt a hardline negotiating position siding with Israel against Palestine. He was then asked a question about the Palestinian right of return and essentially just bluffed his way through the answer, claiming, well, that should be negotiable, which anyone who knows anything about the right of return knows that that's never going to be on the table at all. And Cain later, about 24 hours later, finally copped to the fact that he had no idea what the right of return was when he was answering the question. When asked this past week about China, he talked about China, developing a nuclear weapons program, and that was a serious source of concern, which makes me wonder if he went to a time machine and went back to 1963. He was asked by a reporter, his foreign policy spokesman, about what his plan was on Afghanistan. The spokesman responded by inviting the reporter to brief the candidate as an indication of how much that candidate needs to know. And in general, the summary of Herman Cain's foreign policy approach was that he said, I have no idea who the president of Uzbekistan is, and let me ask you a question, even if I did, would that create one American job? This sort of highlights the more general point about the GOP and foreign policy right now, again, the candidates, not the rest of the GOP, which is their lack of attention by the candidates to foreign policy. Foreign Affairs magazine has asked these candidates, at least the major ones, to publish something in Foreign Affairs. That was done during the 2008 cycle. All the candidates have refused to date, indicating a lack of interest. And, you're starting to see Republican foreign policy heavyweights arguing that this is a problem. On This Week, just yesterday, Condoleezza Rice said that foreign policy ought to be more of a debate than it is. Joe Biden recently argued that, quote, there's a minimum threshold any man or woman has to cross on national security and foreign policy for the American people to think that you're remotely eligible to be president, and these guys have a long way to go. When Joe Biden is, arguing that other people, are not speaking coherently on something, that's a really, really serious an important accusation. And that said, what amount of debate there has been on foreign policy in the debates so far has really been entirely misplaced. Almost, if you want to talk about foreign policy debates, the biggest issue has mostly been immigration. And I haven't seen a single one of these candidates mention the fact that illegal immigration has plummeted since 2008, because the best way to solve the illegal immigration problem is to have a recession, because then people don't want to come here to get a job. And yet that hasn't come up. So on the whole, if you take a look at the state of the foreign policy debate among the GOP, it's pretty deplorable. Now, why is that? Because it's entirely politically rational for all of these candidates to act this way. So, as the policy wonk, I'm appalled. If I was a political, operative, I wouldn't necessarily, advise my candidates to do any differently to necessarily bone up on foreign policy. Again, from a strictly political perspective. The first reason is that no one cares. You are all in this room, you care, but you represent a very, very tiny fraction of the American people. Cain's logic in some ways is actually revealing. This is going to be an election about the economy, and the economy. Foreign policy is probably not going to be a terribly high-profile issue. Therefore, why should the candidates spend that much time about it? Furthermore, this is backed up by polling data. In October, the Wall Street Journal and NBC put out a poll showing that 6% of Americans thought that foreign policy and national security should be the top priority in Washington. That's not a large number. And the contrast here is fascinating. There have been elections in the past that were clearly decided on foreign policy, or foreign policy played a major role. Gerald Ford, in part, lost the '76 election because he mistakenly said that Poland was part of the NATO alliance, which it wasn't back then. Jimmy Carter in 1980 lost in no small part because of the Iranian hostage issue. Michael Dukakis appeared in a tank, and that pretty much doomed his candidacy. You aren't seeing things like that necessarily going to be playing out this year. Another reason is that, to be fair, to criticize the president on foreign policy actually brings up something that would be considered, relatively speaking, a strength of the Obama administration. In that same NBC Wall Street Journal poll, 61% of Americans approve of Obama's handling on foreign policy, which is far higher than his handling on the economy. So it makes sense that you're not going to criticize him. And I think Michael's point here is relatively interesting, the point that you can point to tangible successes, the death of Osama bin Laden, the overthrow of Gaddafi, although I don't know if I would call that as a continuation of the Bush administration strategy on Libya. The fact that on the whole, I think he's actually handled the Pacific Rim relatively well, although he's been the beneficiary of China's gaffes on that. And the withdrawal of forces from Iraq, which is, again, implementing the Bush administration policy, but is also wildly popular. Even if some of these successes are short-term or dubious, or for that matter, unrelated to Obama's grand strategy, that's not how the rationally ignorant public is going to think. They're going to think of these outcomes and associate them with Obama. And so in some ways, therefore, there's not that much of a reason to criticize him on that. And third, and this actually, I'm not going to even go there because Michael said it, there actually hasn't been all that much daylight between the Obama administration and what Republicans have by and large said on foreign policy. On issues like Homeland Security, on issues like, TSA, the TSA punishing, leakers, anti-terrorism, you name it. There hasn't been that much daylight between the two of them on substantive issues. I think that is going to change now because of the drawdown of forces in Afghanistan and, to some extent, the withdrawal in Iraq. And so you might see more, divides on those issues. But, the first couple of years of the Obama administration, there wasn't that much to talk about. And finally, there's not all that much to gain from the perspective of the candidates to making foreign policy pronouncements, because by and large, these foreign policy pronouncements, and again, I agree with Michael on this, don't matter all that much once people become president. It's worth remembering that George W. Bush, when he was running for president in 2000, talked about the notion that there had to be humility in foreign affairs. We're a humble nation. We're not going to engage in state building. And then 9/11 happens. At this point in the well, no, not quite at this point in the 2008, but, in the spring of 2008, during the campaign, the fiercest battle between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton was which one of these two candidates was going to rip up NAFTA first. Obviously, that didn't happen. So, to some extent, a lot of what is said during the campaign isn't necessarily all that big of a deal. What does matter in terms of foreign policy, I would argue, during the campaign is primarily how these arguments play to domestic publics. And you can see that in a couple of ways. First, I agree with Michael, there's been a, by and large, GOP rejection of the notion of American declinism. I think there are possible strategic reasons for this, but there's also an obvious political reason, which is no one wants to talk about declinism. No one wants to hear the United States might no longer be number one, or that the United States' relative power is declining. Declinism is not a good sell. Growth is a good sell. And so, for example, Herman Cain's response on how he's going to deal with China is to outgrow China. Now, I can give you, and I'm pretty sure Michael can as well, one of any number of reasons why that will not happen. But that said, there is a glimmer of logic to it, which is growth actually does cure a lot of ills for the United States economy and for United States leadership. So if you can jumpstart growth, that matters a fair amount. But that said, it's one of these statements that sounds really great and you're not necessarily going to be held to it. And I would also add, by the way, that this is not unique to the GOP. In 2004, when Howard Dean was the leading candidate for president in the Democrats, he talked about the fact that there might be a time when America would no longer be number one. And John Kerry hit him extremely hard on that point. And it was, you can argue, one of the beginnings of Kerry's takeover of Dean. I think another point in which the foreign policy debate has really been about domestic politics is that the primary issue on which most of the GOP candidates have hit Obama, particularly on allies throwing allies under the bus, is about Israel. That is Cain's one clear foreign policy statement. His Cain doctrine in his book was there will be no daylight between the United States and Israel. Perry talked about an obligation to defend Israel, not just as an American, but as a Christian, no less. And that's the evangelical vote talking. And similarly, whenever anyone talks about Obama throwing allies under the bus, the primarily thing is about Israel. And because this plays well with evangelical Christians, this is a smart political move. In terms of foreign policy, I think it's bad for a couple of reasons in terms of the state of the debate. The first is that because of the parlous state of the debate, I haven't seen actually good criticisms of Barack Obama. And there are a lot of good criticisms that can be made. I agree with Michael. His foreign policy is far from perfect. You can argue he relied way too much on sort of soft power during his first 2 years in office. He's relied way too much on the G20 to accomplish things that, if the last summit was any indication, they won't accomplish. And so there are issues like that I think are worthy of criticism. And the second thing is that even foreign policy neophytes in the past went to foreign policy school before they ran for president. George W. Bush did not know a lot about foreign policy before he decided to run in 1998. But that said, he brought most of the major, foreign policy heavyweights on the GOP side down to Crawford to actually try to school him on these issues. And at least he made the effort. When you look at someone like Cain, they're not even making the effort. And this stuff is intrinsically important because we're not, as much as this race is going to be about the economy, in the end, the president, as Michael points out, is going to have to make very important decisions about where to expend blood and treasure. And while probably any person will eventually, after a few years on the job, know something about foreign policy, it's those first few years that are actually important. And indeed, I would argue that one of the reasons why there has been a fair amount of continuity between Bush and Obama is because the foreign policy of George W. Bush in 2007 looked very, very different from the foreign policy of George W. Bush in 2003. And so as a result, in some ways, it sort of reverted back to what you would argue sort of the mainstream foreign policy consensus is. And that way, Obama has kind of continued it. If you have someone like Herman Cain as president, I honestly don't know what will happen. And that's a really interesting question. But we're about to have 2 debates, I think, on foreign policy, one this Saturday and one, I think, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. So it'll be very interesting to see, what we hear from the candidates at either of those debates. I can only think the only possible direction the quality of the rhetoric can go is up, though. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Let me take the privilege of the chair and ask the first question. Dan, you talked about what the candidates are saying. You talked about what people are saying in the campaign. I'm wondering if you and also Michael could extend the aperture a little bit and talk about the advisors to the candidates, what kind of folks the main candidates have assembled as advisors, and specifically, let's talk about Romney, because he does seem to be the most likely nominee right now. Who knows? You never can tell. But let's talk about Romney's advisors and talk about what kind of foreign policy they are likely to put together. On Romney's website, he lists 23 foreign policy advisors, and these are all very deeply experienced people. They've been in it a long time. They've written a lot. You can kind of tell what they think. They're quite heterogeneous, so it matters a lot which one of them has the presidency and who doesn't. But the names include Mitchell Reese, and I've seen him referred to as in some kind of special leadership role. He's thought of as a very pragmatic guy. Now president of which university, I'm forgetting, but he's
William and Mary.
William and Mary. Well, no, he's formerly William and Mary. He's in a new university now. Okay. Anyway, Mitch Reese, Dan Senior, who was in the Bush administration, Jim Talent, former U.S. Senator from Missouri, who's been lately very involved in the terror issue, Vin Weber, former congressman from Minnesota, big thinker on all policy questions, Dov Zakheim, who's a very experienced figure in the defense field, Robert Joseph, who does East Asia stuff, Bob Kagan, who's one of the most well-known, sort of often labeled as neoconservative foreign policy thinkers, but a very prominent one, very widely published, Andrew Natsios, who's very famous for many things he's done, Megan O'Sullivan, who teaches at the Kennedy School now, but was in the Bush administration, Cofer Black, who was in the counterterror business, Michael Chertoff, who of course was head of Department of Homeland Security for quite some time, Elliot Cohen, who's a very distinguished professor of security studies at Johns Hopkins, and others. Can you guys talk about, okay, fine, the candidates, they're not focused. Okay, they're not reading the books, they're not getting the briefings. In the end, what happens in a situation like that? The advisors are going to drive decisions if the president is a listening type. Some presidents don't listen so much, but if the president's a listening type, the advisors matter. Can you talk about the advisors and where you think, if Romney is president, they will take things?
Well, I have to, it's probably better that I defer mostly to Dan on this because a lot of these people are close friends of mine. And so I happen to think that that team which you read, basically, what these people have in common, as far as I can tell, is that they're all very smart. And they all have deep expertise. I mean, you mentioned that, just to take Megan O'Sullivan, for example, who's a professor down the road at Harvard and so forth. And I think that's the type of person who's there. Now, I think what it tells us more, though, is that, as Dan said, Romney's campaign is the one that is clearly farthest along in terms of its development on the foreign policy front. I would differ with Dan. I think it's a little bit unfair, to say that, for example, Rick Perry's speech at the VFW was vacuous. I think in many ways, what some of the statements these candidates are making about foreign policy at this point are placeholders. Because this has been kind of a late starting campaign, and a lot of them, I think, simply haven't gotten to that point that Romney has, and I think Huntsman has as well, where they put out white papers and so forth and started naming advisors. So I think in many ways, you can read this list for Romney. I'm not sure you can for the other candidates. I'm not sure they've gotten to that point.
I mean, I would say a few things. First of all, I mean, I think one of the people on that list was a roommate of mine during graduate school, so I'm also hopelessly biased on this, at least for some of these people. I think most of the people on the Romney list is are pretty solid. I also think this is one of my secret, leading indicators for who's going to be the nominee, is how good is the foreign policy, who do the foreign policy heavyweights line up behind? Because by and large, there aren't that many doctrinal differences among, the GOP candidates, with Ron Paul, I think, accepted. And really, if you're a foreign policy advisor, all you want to do is try to figure out who's the winning team, because that's the way in which you potentially might actually get a job. So I think in some ways the fact that Romney has assembled this team, is a sense in which the foreign policy cognoscenti, although God knows we're not always the savviest of political groups, is making their bet as to who's going to win. I think it's fair to say that in some cases, the candidates have been slow on the draw. On the other hand, Herman Cain's been running for the last 18 months at this point, and he still hasn't put together a foreign policy team. I think, to be fair, he probably, it's not clear his campaign expected to be where he is at this point in terms of public opinion. Similarly, with Rick Perry, I think Rick Perry is probably the biggest cipher in the field at this point. In that sense, he's much later, off the mark, because he didn't start until August. And there were some rumors about who was meeting Will Inboden, among others, but we haven't heard anything. There's simply been no rhetoric, and no foreign policy advisors of prominence, at least, linked to him. That said, I would offer one cautionary note, which is it's not guaranteed at this stage, if you look at the foreign policy spokesman or the sort of advisors for a candidate, those don't necessarily map perfectly as to who winds up being in administration. And again, you need no better evidence than that to look at the Barack Obama campaign in 2008. If I had told you again in the spring of 2008 that Hillary Clinton was going to be the Secretary of State, that would have prompted many, many laughs. And so, I think there's a danger of overreading the tea leaves at this point in terms of looking at some of the candidate advisors.
Great. I invite anybody who wants to ask a question or give a speech, if it's a short and polite, to do so, although you can do it at the mics. I guess we don't have a wandering mic, bearing in mind that we're trying to film this. So also, in light of that, it'd be nice if you identify yourself, and I'll ask a few questions too, but let's go to folks at the mic.
The fact that Republicans and Democrats think that the return of the Palestinian refugees is non-negotiable shows what's wrong with American foreign policy in general. It used to be, though, that the Republican Party had some Israel skeptics like James Baker and George Shultz. Or if you go back a little further, Dwight Eisenhower was probably the most even-handed president in either party with regards to the Middle East. But George Bush, too, apparently felt that a large part of his father's defeat in his bid for re-election in the second term was attributable to the Israel lobby, and he immediately then, when his own re-election campaign came up, began courting the Israel lobby more assiduously than any Republican candidate had done prior to that. And it appears, with the exception now of Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan, there aren't any more Israel skeptics left in the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party, of course, has always been in the hip pocket of the Israel lobby. And this is an issue where American foreign policy departs from the principles, of course, that it professes. And it's caused a big problem in the world. And it doesn't appear that the reaction of the world is influencing foreign policy, both in the Republican and Democratic Party, on this issue as much as reaction to domestic pressures are. And that was further reaffirmed in the election of Bob Turner in the special New York congressional election. So it appears that there's no space left in America's major parties, outside of the principled Ralph Nader, to redirect American foreign policy because of the domestic pressures which have been exerted on the Republican Party since Bush II and throughout the history of the Democratic Party since LBJ.
Why don't I ask for a comment from either one of you? Want to comment?
Look, I would say, look, it's fine as a conspiracy theory. I don't think it works out, though, when you look at the reality of policy. Bill Clinton, both President Bush's, President Obama have both made clear the value that they see in the U.S.-Israel relationship, and it goes beyond the Palestinian issue. It goes beyond the peace process to things like military cooperation, intelligence sharing, joint, common interest in the Middle East, and so forth. And I think you're going to find that whoever gets elected next, whether it's President Obama or the Republican candidate, that'll continue because, in my view, there's real strategic value in this relationship, and that's that. When it comes to the peace process, look, here's another example in my mind of continuity. We talk about the Oslo Accords under President Clinton, which led to Camp David, which obviously didn't succeed and led instead to collapse of the talks and an intifada. And yet in June of 2002, you have President George W. Bush calling for a Palestinian state, the first president to explicitly do that. And ultimately, by 2007, you're back on the negotiating track and so forth with the Annapolis Conference and the process which followed. I expect that the next president, Democrat or Republican, will want to see the parties get out of this kind of downward spiral that they're in and back to serious negotiations, and will also espouse a two-state solution to the conflict. And I expect that whoever the next president is will continue to work closely with Israel on a wide range of things.
Dan.
Yeah, a few things. First of all, if you get the Palestinian negotiators good and liquored up, they're going to acknowledge the right of return is not going to be an issue that they're going to get in terms of peace deal. So, this is not something that that American presidents are necessarily going to be pushing for, because the Palestinians know that in the end that's something they're going to have to give up if they want to get an independent state. On this point, and furthermore, it should be pointed out that in some ways this is actually, I think, Obama's biggest blunder potentially in his first term, was the way he adopted the negotiating position, or what he wanted before the Israelis and Palestinians went to the peace table, which was a freeze on all housing settlements, which you can argue for whatever reasons might have been a good thing, but it was actually a harder position than what the Palestinians themselves originally adopted. And so as a result, it actually forced the Palestinians to toughen up their position. Now, once you do that, the only way, at that point, what you have to do is then continue to insist on that position if someone like, let's say, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu decides, no, I'm going to continue the housing settlements. But in the end, this is an instance where, in fact, Obama blinked, he backed down, and as a result, has really led to a mess in terms of the status of negotiations. So either you adopt a tough position and then follow it through, or you don't. But what I think in some ways the Obama administration did was the worst of both worlds. And then one last point, which is to say that, that the problem with the GOP, or for that matter with the Democrats, is that they're not responding to the reaction of the world, but rather the reaction of domestic, political pressures. Well, to some extent, that's how democratic politics is actually supposed to work. In theory, if you're going to be advancing the national interest, what you hope is that it advances your own country's welfare. Now, obviously, the position of most American presidents has been that advancing the national interest is also advancing global interests, and you hope that's the case. But to accuse politicians of acting politically, I think is a little much.
Great. I want to ask Michael a kind of cosmic, tough question, and forgive me for asking you kind of a question that's kind of too big and
I was trained in astrophysics, so I'm fine with it.
Cosmic. There you go. It's sort of too big for a short answer, but if you want to give one, we won't pound on you for it. Which is, you talked about Republicans having principles and the need for a party to have principles, and I guess the shortest way for me to frame my question is, fine, tell us what they are. I think you've done a good thing here, sort of being willing to summarize, quote, Republican views. Usually people don't want to generalize because, of course, across the Republican spectrum, you've got a lot of diversity ranging from Ron Paul to, others.
John Bolton.
Yeah, John Bolton. But thank you for that, because, of course, there is a center of gravity, and we'd like to talk about what it is. And if you want to use the Romney Advisor Group as that, you can. But what are the principles? And let me frame the question a little with a little preface. I think of two ways to talk about foreign policy or to frame foreign policy. One is sort of a principle-based way of analysis or way of framing policy. Let's frame some abstract principles that we ought to live by, and then do our best to bring policy into line with them. The second way of doing it is to have sort of, if you will, national interest-based discussion in which you frame national interests, setting priorities on the highest, divine threats to those interests, whatever they are, but trying to focus on the worst, then divine strategies to cope with those threats, with the most effective taking priority, then define missions you need to execute to carry out those strategies, and then define capabilities, military or otherwise, you need to carry out those missions. So you sort of think about national interests, define them. That's the big debate. You know, what are the interests of the country? And then second, the next big debate is going to be, what are the main threats to the country? So if you want to answer by talking about principles, that's fine. If you and I were in a seminar for hours and hours, I would eventually say, can you tell me the Republican view of foreign policy framed the second way? What are the primary national interests that our foreign policy should defend, which may sound kind of ABC-ish, but to me it really isn't. Second, what are the biggest threats to those interests? And today, I think the big debate there is, what is the biggest national security threat the U.S. faces? Is it WMD terror, for example, which Bush said he believed, Obama says he believes, or is it a more traditional sort of geopolitical threat posed by the rise of China, Chinese power, and the danger China will outburst the bounds that limit it and dominate Eurasia in a way that threatens the U.S.? Or is it other threats or interests, if you will, such as democratization, which Bush featured so heavily in his second inaugural, and which now comes very much to life with the Arab Spring and whether the U.S. should support it, and which Obama then did support in Libya? Or is it human rights, and what's the position of human rights and the threats to them that appear? War itself, does the U.S. have an interest in limiting war and promoting peace, which the U.S. often winds up doing? Where does that fit in the priority? I'm going down a list, sort of with the biggest at the top. The defense of traditional American allies like Israel or Taiwan. Climate change, where does that fit in? An open world economy, what about that? In other words, can you talk about basic...
I'm glad he's asking you this, because I don't want to answer this.
Right.
Could you repeat the question?
Unfair. Could I repeat the question? Unfair. So maybe you just want to take the very first way I framed it. Talk principles, what should they be? But if you want to share thoughts on fundamental national interest and the gravest threats that you think the Republican center of gravity community sees, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm pretty sure that Dan covers this in an entire course over at Tufts. So I'm not. I'll do my best to answer it in 2 minutes. Look, I think that when these terms mean a lot of different things to different people. I think, though, that if, as the Republican candidates express it, and I think really the best way of expressing it, to be simple about what is the difference, is that I think the Republican candidates will tell you that they believe America has moral authority, that America can be a force for good in the world, and we don't sort of shy away from that, that we don't need to point to universal rights, we don't need to point to sort of international documents, but we sort of point to this is what America believes in, and we believe that it's something that has sort of universal appeal. We believe there's something kind of unique or exceptional, as they say, about the United States, and we act sort of in that manner. Now, you can, a cynic will poke all sorts of holes in that and point out examples of where we didn't act according to such principles. But the point is, do you believe that America has that moral authority and can be a force for good? The question isn't, do you think that we always have done that? Of course, we haven't. There have been plenty of exceptions. So that is one way to answer it. When you get into the sort of what I think of as the second part of your question about principles and interests and how do you rate the interests and how do you rate the principles and so forth, I think that it's not as though you're kind of choosing between the two. The way that I would put it is that your principles, in a sense, will guide the way you prosecute your strategy, the way you pursue your interests, or at least they should. And in some of your principles, some of the things which we might consider principles, may cross the boundary into actual interests themselves, such as promoting democracy overseas. I think there's, in my mind, a good case to be made that promoting democracy overseas, promoting human rights overseas, and political participation, free markets, and things like that, is actually an interest of ours because we tend to have good, peaceful relations with fellow democracies. And there's also, of course, a moral dimension to that as well, and the two are blended. I think that, look, all Americans, I think to a significant extent, want their government to pursue their interests in accordance with a kind of a common set of American principles or a sense of morality. I doubt, I think you'd have a hard time finding a lot of people who didn't believe that. So that's why I say I think the principle. Now, when you asked me what are the actual interests, can we form a list and so forth, I'm not sure I even remember the things you listed. But clearly, this is a process in my mind which should happen as early as possible in the administration, if not before the administration actually comes into office. You know, forming an actual national security strategy, which, look, may be a sort of the great white whale of government, but if you look at our national security strategy documents, they're not really national security strategies. They're just kind of, here's a great list of the 500 things that everyone in the interagency wants to do without any sense of priority or purpose to them. And that really is not useful as a strategy. A strategy is, you know, Southwest Airlines, low cost. Everything we do is aimed at low cost. I don't know that a government can have that sort of strategy. You know, Elliot Cohen, a friend of mine who is also one of the people you list as a Romney advisor, would tell you there really isn't such a thing as grand strategy. Others who are in his field would say, no, that's not right, and so forth. And that's an interesting academic debate, but the fact is that, you know, still you do have to have a sense in a government of what your interests are, and I think that should be done early on in the process.
I don't know if you want to comment. I was really
it's
poking him to expand on that. I guess I'd also ask both speakers here, because they both know the discussion that's happened on the campaign trail and know the advisors, to talk about main solutions that we can expect the Republican victor, if there is a Republican victor in the election, to pursue. Let's just talk a little bit about sort of broad-based ways of solving foreign policy problems. I tend to think of 4 very different ways of solving a problem when you got a problem. Accommodation, let's make friends. You mentioned Obama's outreach to Iran, or people who've called for some kind of engagement with Cuba, or past efforts to do sort of resolve things through accommodation and engagement. Containment, that's a familiar one. George Kennan. Some people are now calling for containment, for example, of Pakistan. That the whole problem of Pakistan's radicalism and support for the Taliban in Afghanistan and so forth calls for a policy of containment of Pakistan, or containment of China. There's a much more serious question: how shall the U.S. cope with the rise of China? Shall the U.S. have an accommodationist approach? Let's get along. Let's make deals, have understandings, or shall we have a containment strategy? Third strategy, sort of drawn from both the old traditions of Republican thinking and really of Bush 43's foreign policy, is rollback. Let's understand some problems are solved in the world by regime change and by not just standing idly by and containing, but changing regimes, even invading countries. I'm not saying it's not really sort of on anyone's agenda right now for any particular country, but Obama just did it to Libya. And it was on the Bush. Let's just say some folks in the Bush orbit were talking about that as the answer to Iran back in 2003. Clinton really was talking about it as the answer to North Korea back in 1994 when we nearly went to war with North Korea. Back in the 50s, some Republicans called for it as the answer to the Cold War. So what about that? And fourth is the whole question of isolation, withdrawal from the world. As you know, back in the day, way back in the 1930s and 40s, the Republican Party was really more isolationist than the Democratic, and it took quite a while for the Republicans to buy onto the notion of global engagement and a global policy. You have Ron Paul sort of resurrecting that, if you will. Which do you think is the sort of, talk about the strength of these sort of thought patterns among Republican, especially advisors as well as candidates. Second, talk a little bit about multilateral versus unilateral ways of solving problems. One huge distinction that a lot of people see between, for example, Bush 43, George W., and Bush 41, George H.W., was George H.W. was very invested in the notion of don't go fishing alone. Tom Sawyer, have the other boys whitewash that fence. That's good. Get the allies in there to help you. You know, I share this view myself. You know, I look back at World War II. The Americans lost 3% of the total Allied debt in World War II. Basically, the Allies won that war for us. It's a good way to operate in foreign affairs. You were talking about how Democrats are skeptical, you know, institutions and all the rest. They want to be constrained by them. Well, the good side of getting involved in institutions and alliances is other people do the work too. Bush 43 had a very different view from Bush 41. The only real partner we had in the Iraq War was Britain, and they did some good work. In Afghanistan, I would say, you know, Europe was doing half the work at the time that Bush left, so I don't want to say Bush was never multilateral, but his main approach was unilateral. Many people, I think, in the Bush foreign policy entourage thought of allies as a nuisance. You know, they'd get in the way. You got to consult them all the time, and they always have some unpragmatic requests or conditions for action. So can you talk, both of you, about the reflexes that you expect the next Republican president, and I'm really thinking Romney and his team, but if you want to change that, go right ahead, toward these questions of broad solution types to problems like the ones I mentioned, and broad decisions on questions of to what extent do you cooperate with others to solve problems?
I guess my answer is I'll reject your premise a little bit in that, you talked about 4 different, possible ways of dealing with countries, and I actually think the better way to think about it, especially for the Republicans at this point, is Walter Russell Mead's sort of different typology that he came up with in his book Special Providence. I think most of the foreign policy candidates would fall under the sort of the Jacksonian approach to foreign affairs, which is to say, respond to aggression with aggression, and be willing to respond in a unilateral manner. I think if you look at Romney, though, Romney might be a bit more of what's called what was Mead referred to as the Hamiltonian approach, which was a little more measured and a little more multilateral, and a greater focus to some extent on international economics. The overarching constraint, and you have to remember this, I think, regardless of what anyone says during the campaign trail, is that if you take a look at the foreign, public opinion polling, Americans haven't been more isolationist in their attitudes since the mid-'70s. I think in one poll taken in 2010, over a majority, 51% of Americans basically say we should just leave the rest of the world alone. Now, that's not actually that much of a hard constraint when it comes to foreign policy because the president has such, authority to act. But that said, it does probably mean that any president that gets involved in military action has got to be reasonably sure that it's going to end with a U.S. victory with those poll numbers. And so I therefore doubt that for all the tough rhetoric you're going to hear on things like Iran or what have you, that there's actually going to be any action taken on that front. There's not going to be a rollback or regime change. There would be containment, which is, by the way, the policy that's being pursued now.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to reject your premise as well. I think that the 4 ways you listed of solving a problem, I don't think you could responsibly have a preference for one of these ways. I mean, the question is, what is the problem? I think that you expressed it better in a sense in your previous question. You have to sort of assess the problem. What are the interests at stake and so forth? What are the tools at your disposal and so forth? There are some regimes, for example, which you could interfere with their interests by trying to diplomatically isolate them. There's other regimes which, frankly, might thrive under diplomatic isolation. And you have to be careful, which kind of regime you're dealing with. Certain interests and objectives by foreign countries we can certainly accommodate because they may coincide with our interests, and so on and so forth. So I think you have to assess each problem on its own, and I would certainly hope that this is what any president would do. I mean, to have a preference over one tactic it seems to me not sensible. In terms of this question of multilateral versus unilateral, I have to say I disagree with the characterization. The fact is that if I think about the problems I worked on in the Bush administration, Iran, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, in no case did we want to act unilaterally, or did we act unilaterally? I mean, when it comes to Iran, I mean, in fact, on both issues, we created international groupings to give us more leverage and sort of influence on the problem at hand. So for Iran, we created this P5+1 grouping, which included Russia and China, which are not necessarily that easy to work with. On the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's easy to forget that President Bush is the one who came out with this quartet idea. The UK, EU, it's the US, EU, Russia, and UN, So I don't think, and just from a personal sort of point of view, as a practitioner of policy, often what you do in reality on a day-to-day basis when you're making policy is a lot of it is kind of here's a problem. It's the same problem as we had yesterday, but you're trying to catalog what are the new policy tools, what are the levers remaining to us. And you're always going to have a category for international or multilateral. What can we do at the UN? What can we do in this forum and that forum? I really don't suspect that that's going to change anytime soon. The key question is effectiveness, and how do you see these institutions? How do you see coalitions or multilateral organizations and so forth? Is it, are those multilateral institutions or international institutions an end in themselves, or are they vehicles for helping us to advance our interests? And I think that what probably the Republican candidates would say, and what I would say, is that the foremost question is how can we be effective and how can we advance our interests? And to the extent these institutions help us with that, then we should try to utilize them. To the extent they interfere with that, then that's a problem to be solved. And I have to say that the fact that you think that being a part of multilateral institutions means that others do the work suggests to me that you haven't actually served at the United Nations, because I think you'd find that's probably not true. So that's my response. I think that it's actually much more complicated than you make out.
Great. Well, if you folks don't stop me, I'll ask more questions. I got a whole ton of them here. Go ahead.
You brought up the kind of change in the international view of the United States after Obama was elected. There was an outpouring of global support for him. So I was wondering if you could talk about, are there any ways that we could better leverage this outpouring of support every time we hit the reset button on the president? Is there something that we could do better? Because as you brought up, that there was an outpouring of support, but we haven't really gotten the results that everyone really wanted out of it. We haven't solved the Israel problem. We haven't solved all sorts of things. Resurgent Russia, China. So are there ways that, is there a Republican perspective that we could better leverage this change in administration? You talk about continuity, but at the same time, it's clear that there's a difference in public opinion around the world every time we change administrations.
Well, I'll just answer this briefly, and maybe Dan has some thoughts too. My view is that it's a long way from successful public opinion polls in foreign countries to actually getting the support of foreign governments for the things you want to do in building international coalitions. And really, it's the latter which we should be focused on. And to the extent to which the two connect is really the question. And I think that's probably different from place to place.
I would say this isn't necessarily a GOP or Democrat question. I mean, I've talked to a fair number of people who worked for the Obama administration, particularly the first 2 years, and they're willing to acknowledge the fact that one of their mistakes or misperceptions they made was the belief that, and this went up to the president, I would argue, that because they were doing better in the polls overseas, that would translate into more concrete policy accomplishments. And I think they thought it would just sort of happen. And to be fair, there is something of a logic to this, which is that presumably if America is more popular in other countries, and then you ask those countries to pursue particular policies, it should be less costly for those governments to do that because they're not going right into the teeth of their own public opinions. The problem is that it turned out that on a lot of these issues, there were genuine policy disagreements. This wasn't just about leaders not doing something because they had to deal with anti-Americanism at home. That was just a very great excuse for not doing things they didn't want to do anyway. So I think part of the problem is that expecting that that the popularity either of a particular president or of the U.S. government or what have you will translate into concrete achievements, I think is a chimera.
Great. The time's running down. I'm going to close by asking you both to talk about solutions to immediate questions that are on the front burner, specifically China, Pakistan, and Iran. Really simple ones.
Yeah.
What do you both expect? And if you want to talk about what you wish the next president would do, please do it. But with China, there was a huge internal dispute within the Bush 43 administration on what to do. In the end, the vice president's office favored a fairly harder line toward China. In the end, the Bush administration adopted a fairly, I think, more of a modus vivendi approach to China. Where's that going to go under a Romney administration? And I'm asking this because, to me, managing the rise of China is the most fateful issue in world politics that involves great powers for the next many years to come. You know, will this be handled correctly or poorly? I think many wise people think that if this is mismanaged, we could wind up in a Cold War with China. Where would that go? Second, to just put the toughest foreign policy problem out there, what to do about Pakistan. It's a multifarious problem, often referred to as the most dangerous country in the world. No one likes to talk about it because no one has any answers, but hey, what are the answers? Please tell me. And third is Iran and the Iranian nuclear program. We've heard talk very recently of the possibility of military action to solve this problem, and of course, if you look carefully, even the military options look terrible. Talk about, if you want to talk about what they should do, that's fine, but what do you think the next president will do if it's a Republican president and following the kind of thinking of the advisor team we talked about, both of you?
Well, I guess I'll just, it's clearly too much to bite off in the time we have remaining, so I'll just talk about the last one, Iran, which is something I focus a little bit more on. And I should say from the outset, I don't know what the next administration is going to be, much less what it will do. You asked about a Romney administration. I think that's, in my view, premature. I think that the next president, you know, if this president isn't already faced with this, the next president's going to be faced with a very difficult decision on Iran, because the report of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is about to come out, will basically say that Iran is much farther along on some elements of its nuclear weapons program than previously reported. And so there's a question as to what are the red lines, and we're getting awfully close to them, if not having already passed them as some of these things happen. And you have to weigh how can we prevent Iran from acquiring that nuclear weapon, and if we can't, you do that through a mix of sanctions and diplomacy and so forth. Should we be willing to use military force? To me, there are elements of policy which really need to be restored if we're to have a hope of solving this problem short of using military force, which I think, you know, ultimately everyone, I think, shares that desire to not have to use military force. To me, though, one of the things we most clearly need to do is restore the credibility that we may use military force, which I think is the one part of the policy which most clearly has diminished over the last couple of years. Because I think that without that fear, the Iranian regime sees a little obstacle between itself and that nuclear weapons capability, which I do believe that they want. So I think that the next president, whoever it is, will have to focus very much on restoring that kind of deterrent, that U.S. deterrent, that allied deterrent, which in many ways has withered recently. And that's not going to be easy. I think, you know, trying to restore pressure, which has in many ways been relieved, is simply not going to be easy. I left China and Pakistan for you, Dan.
Yeah, so you gave me China and Pakistan. You gave me the easy ones. Look, I think U.S. policy towards China is, you know, that's actually been one of the few constants you can argue over the last 30 years, regardless of the administration in power. In some ways, I think this is an area where the Obama administration has done relatively well. They've done relatively well because China did relatively badly in 2009 and 2010. I think they overreacted to what happened during the financial crisis, and as a result, managed to scare a lot of the periphery in the Pacific Rim to wanting to the United States to take a greater role. So in some ways, I think what U.S. policy should actually, in this sense, be a combination of sort of proactive in terms of building structures such that you don't want to contain China, but you certainly want hedging mechanisms in place in case China does take a turn towards the more hawkish. And that said, you do want to let China's own, you know, policies determine how you're going to respond on this, I would think. So, and I don't think it matters who wins in 2012. That'll still be the policy. On Pakistan, you know, I'm going to punt. If I had a good Pakistan policy, you know, it would be, well, I wouldn't be a rich man, but I'd be a very, very powerful man. But, you know, that's an incredibly hard policy. I think one of the interesting questions going forward will be whether or not, by the time 2013 rolls around, how much of U.S. forces will be out of Afghanistan. And if they're out of Afghanistan, then the question becomes, how serious of a problem is Pakistan? Because even if you've got a situation where the Taliban is thriving in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, that affects primarily Afghanistan and Pakistan. You know, and that might be an instance where, in fact, the U.S. position is going to be, so long as al-Qaeda does not, you know, resurrect its base in either of those places, and if they do, we can just deal with that with drone strikes, then maybe the answer is that we just contain Pakistan rather than try to change a country that no one has been able to change for the last 50 years.
Michael, you sure you don't want to solve Pakistan? No. Well, we're at the witching hour. I want to thank our panel for a great show.